thing. There's no video, so if you don't clap, it's just awkward silence. So I realized you did that just to avoid us feeling weird together. So and I can respect that. I do a lot of things to avoid feeling awkward. Preaching is not one of those things, but I do other things to avoid feeling awkward. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. We are starting a new series today, and the name of the series is The Corner of Danforth and Coltrane. All last service, I called it The Corner of Danforth and Bryant. So next week, there's going to be a ton of people who are at CVS wondering why we're not having church. So you're here for the correct information, and that's so Danforth and Coltrane is where the church is. So the reason we're calling this series what we're calling it, the actual physical name of the church, or the physical address of the church, is because we're asking questions for the next several weeks, basically asking, like, what are we doing here? Not just like, what are we doing here in sort of like a philosophical, existential way, but like literally, like at this specific location, like if you punched in the church's address into your or the series title into your GPS, you would arrive at the church. So what is it about this location that makes this a specific thing that we need to be talking about? Like, what is where we are just as important as who we are? Or is what we bring to where we are just as important as where we are? So one of the questions that we're kind of pursuing with this series is, what are we doing here? Like, if we were in a different location or a different city, would that actually make us a different church? And so we're going to be asking lots of questions throughout the series of, you know, when we spend time in this place or with people who are also part of this community with us, what are we doing? Why are we here? What kind of things are we looking to receive out of this? But also, what kinds of things are we looking to put back into it? So who are we trying to be? What are we trying to do? But also, inversely, we also have to address questions like, well, what are we not trying to do? Like, are there things that we're actually trying not to be that help us? Because anytime you choose to do something or to be something, you're actually kind of non-verbally deciding to not be the things that would not necessarily fit inside of that vision. So, and one of the things that can happen is when you start talking about what you want to do as a church or who you want to be, it can, to other churches that aren't that thing, it can feel like a criticism or a critique of some sort. That's not what this is meant to be. It's just an acknowledgement that there are lots of churches. There are lots of churches in Oklahoma City, in Edmond, in the entire state of Oklahoma. And there are lots of churches that do lots of different kinds of things. And so the question becomes, well, what are we, the well, attempting to do and be here? So, and I know one of the, I'll go ahead and, so my family and I, we found this church back in October of 2022. We had just moved to Edmond. We were living in, we lived in Texas for as long as we'd been a family. And so we moved up here, and my wife had never lived in Oklahoma. I grew up in Hinton. And so I knew the area pretty well, but my wife Caroline didn't. And so we moved up here. And even as we were sort of planning, like before we even had like loaded the moving truck, one of the questions that she asked was, what are we going to do about church? Like, are there churches that you know of up there that we can go to, or is there a church that you think we would all enjoy? And I told her, I said, I'm not going to lie. I feel like it's very unlikely that the five of us, all of our family, whether we're going to find a church that all five of us feel comfortable and enjoy. Like, I feel like it's unlikely that we're going to find that anytime soon. And so we were kind of braced for kind of a long church journey because, well, and also, the thing is, before we moved here, I was always a pastor at a church. And so I'd never had to look for a church before because I just worked at the church where we would go. And so moving up here, I no longer, that's not my day job anymore. I work at a bank. I do this sometimes, but my actual job is not this. And so having to come up here and start looking for churches and really asking questions about what kind of church are we even looking for? And then it was just by complete luck that we found the well. And it turned out that it was about 5 minutes from our house. And we had looked it up online. Caroline did most of the research. And she said, I think this might be a church that we could really, that we might want to try. And so we came here. And I was completely blown away at just how quickly it felt like, oh, this is, like, I did not know a church like this actually existed in Edmond. I thought, I really, much less so close to where we're going to be moving to. And so it felt like such a gift. It felt like such a surprise of a gift that this place would even be here at all. So we've been here ever since, and I'm so glad we're here. But what that does is it raises questions about well, why? Like and I assume, and I talked to people after the first service, and I know that there are other people who that's a similar story to where you are. You moved to Edmond, and you thought like, well, I don't really know where we're going to go because there's a handful of churches I know about. None of them sound like something where we would really connect, and so maybe you found the well, and your story is very similar to that. And so questions about like, well, what is it about this place that makes this place what it is that made you say, well, maybe this is where we need to be. Maybe this is the kind of community we can really invest ourselves in and participate in. And so one of the things, if you guys were here several months ago, we had a group of people called Ministry Architects. It was a consulting group who's been helping the elders kind of guide us through some leadership transitions and kind of trying to hone in on a focus of what it is we want the church to look like going forward. And so we had kind of a town hall event here, and I know some of y'all were here for this. And one of the questions that they raised was, well, imagine the church 2, 3, 5 years from now, like what do you hope it looks like? And so people would answer with various questions about like, well, like more of certain types of things or less of certain types of things. And an answer we kept getting over and over was, I'd like to see this place get bigger. And so one of the core answers, one of the recurring answers to the question of how would you like to see the church like develop or whatever in the next 5 years was, well, I'd like it to be bigger. Well, then the question becomes, well, like why? Like what does bigger offer that what the size we're at does not offer? And so I assume a lot of times, and you sort of have to read into like, it's not just like I want it to be bigger so that it can be bigger. It's what exactly do you think happens when churches get bigger? And so I assume by bigger we mean, well, we want more people to discover this incredible community. I think this community is important, has value, is worth being here. And so and I'm sure there are other people in our community who would feel the same way if they knew we were here. So we want that group of people to find us. We want people who are looking for us to know that we're here. So that's one thing, that's one way to interpret, I'd like it to get bigger. Another way to interpret it is, well, we want this church to feel like a stable, thriving place, and numerical growth is often the easiest way to sort of kind of gauge whether or not that's even happening at all. So you can kind of simulate the feeling of the church is doing well because there are lots of people here, And so like in a lot of conversations about churches and church growth and church health, a lot of times big equals good. And we have to wonder, like, is that true? Or is it just a thing that we believe because we assume that the more people are there, that the better it is, because that's why would there be so many people there? And so a question that churches have to begin asking is bigger always better? And so what kind of space, which leads to another question, which is what kind of space are we even trying to create in the first place on Sunday mornings, but also just beyond Sunday morning? So maybe bigger is fine as long as we're still able to remain true to what we do as a church. And so which raises questions about, well, is getting bigger just because we want to be bigger? Would that actually in some ways make us less of what you love about this place? Because in the pursuit of getting bigger, not being bigger in itself, but in that pursuit, we end up having to sacrifice certain types of energy or things that we would do if that is the core pursuit. And I am not trying to critique bigger. In fact, I would love to see more people discover this place like we did. Now, I think the Well is a special, important place, and I know that there are people in Edmond who would love it here if they knew we were here. So I would love for that to happen. But then the question becomes, yeah, but if it's getting bigger just for the sake of getting bigger, is that really the end all be all? Will we feel better if it's just bigger? So maybe bigger is fine as long as we're still able to remain true to what we want to do and be as a church, which of course leads us to the book of John chapter 6. So in John 6, you saw that coming. So in John chapter 6, I'm great at the transitions. In John 6, you have this interesting scene because Jesus has reached a massive amount of people. Jesus' popularity is kind of exploding at this point. He's reached like the height of his popularity. He has just previously to this story we're about to look at, he has just spoken to and fed about 5,000 people, which would, by our standards today, be referred to as a megachurch. And so at a certain point, like all these people are coming and they're trying to absorb as much of what Jesus is doing as possible. And at a certain point, Jesus tries to leave. But the thing is, when you're gaining that much popularity and you try to leave, sometimes people follow you. So the crowd doesn't want Jesus to go, so they follow him, and it turns out he has crossed a body of water. So in John chapter 6, verse 22, it says, the next day the crowds that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away. So Jesus and his disciples have gone somewhere else in a boat or not in a boat. Jesus like ran to catch up on the boat. Well, that's a whole other thing. But and then in verse 25, it says, when they found Jesus on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Which I love. They like followed him all the way to the other side of this body of water. And then when they catch up to him, they're like, oh, hey, well, that's weird. When did you get here? Trying to play it cool, like they're not stalking him. So anyway, and then so Jesus starts to teach. And so this massive group of people will not stop following him. And so he begins to teach. And people are clearly not ready to hear everything he has to say. This is an interesting scene because in any other context, if you were a church leader and you had this like volume of people and this amount of like momentum going for you, you'd be like, I'm going to play the hits. I'm going to do what I can to keep the people in the room and keep them happy. Jesus decides to take a slightly different turn. And so in verse 35, it says, then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And then if you jump down to verse 33, it says, Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, which is a way he would refer to himself, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, which is a pretty big venue. And then on verse 60, it says, on hearing it, many of his disciples, not hangers-on, not people who are spectators, disciples. Many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And then in verse 66, it says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So Jesus has these massive crowds, just like they're hanging on every word. Like he cannot stop the crowd from getting bigger. And then he throws this bizarre curveball out of nowhere, and a bunch of people instantly bail out. There's all, like, the room could not be fuller. People are following him. People have, like, the energy is, like, palpable. And so Jesus says, oh, I see, like, the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to is here. So here's what I have to say. Eat my flesh. And so then then a bunch of the disciples are like, I think we've gone as far as we can go on this one. I think we're going to take off. We're going to try that other church down the road. So what is going on? Like, why would Jesus choose this moment to say something like, and of course now we know, like he's using bread and he's using body and blood as a metaphor for participating in the self-sacrifice of his own death. So if you were a church growth strategist, which is a job that exists, you would probably have to pull Jesus aside at a certain point and say, listen, you're killing us. Like this whole eat my flesh thing, it's not going well. The numbers are in, and it's not looking good. We would really love it if you could do like 3 ways to be a better parent or something like that. Because the eat my flesh thing is just, it's not working with the crowds, and we really do need to like ramp up our numbers. So if you could. So as it turns out, Jesus is pretty bad at church growth. Who knew? So it seems like, what's going on here? So it seems like Jesus believes he's doing something meaningful. And he's not going to allow the need for a larger crowd to stop him from doing what he needs to do. Sometimes the crowd is with you because they don't really know what you're about at all. And so really what you see in this story is Jesus is saying, like, I don't know that they know what they're signing up for. So let's kind of push this to its logical conclusion and see how many people actually do still want to participate in this thing with us. So as it turns out, for Jesus, when things get bigger, it becomes a question of like, is it getting bigger because people are connecting with it in a meaningful way, or is it just getting bigger because bigger happens when this kind of energy enters the room? So then you look in Luke chapter 21, there's another story, and this isn't necessarily about like volume of people, but it also kind of speaks to this same type of mentality. So in Luke chapter 21, you have, and this is kind of a more famous story, but in Luke 21, you have Jesus in the temple area, and there are people who are contributing financially. And it says, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, Jesus said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. What's going on here? So Jesus watches this person gives a small amount and says, this person has actually given more, even though she actually gave less. Why? Because her gift, the thing that she gave, came from something meaningful. It was not an act of posturing. It was not an act of just like having given enough to gain some amount of influence with the people who have power. This is a person who's giving what she has or what she can because she believes that because this type of gift matters. So Jesus says, oh, actually, the smaller gift is the bigger gift. The smaller contribution is the bigger contribution. So in most conversations about how to have a healthy church, someone will always bring up the need to have more people, as if more is always the goal. More is always better, so bigger is always better. Therefore, we got to do everything we can to just get more and bigger. But for Jesus, sometimes less is more, and sometimes more can actually turn out to be less. This is actually something known as the concept of inverse fidelity, and which is the notion that sometimes smaller makes us truer to who we really are than bigger. Bigger is not in and of itself bad. I hope I've made that clear. I'm not critiquing big in and of itself. Like if we grow to a certain size, I'm not going to be like, oh, we blew it. You know what I mean? Like it's not growth in and of itself is not bad. The problem is when bigger becomes the primary driving engine, and it becomes like everything we do is geared towards us being bigger and having more. And so, because whenever the crowd gets bigger, Jesus begins challenging people more directly, basically asking, is this really what you're signing up for, or are you just here because this is where the crowd is? And again, don't get me wrong. I want this church to be a healthy place that people can discover and find a safe and thriving place to be. But that needs to come because we are who we are and who we're called to be, and not because we put together a church growth strategy that guaranteed maximum amount of like increase in like seats filled or whatever. I've known pastors who they will be pastors of larger churches, and then there will be some sort of governing board, like elder board or larger like group of people who are setting goals for the pastor and kind of like dangling that pastor's job over their head and saying like, look, you need to grow to a certain amount, or we're going to have to find somebody else who can. And so that pastor will then begin, like, let's say the goal is 5,000. So then the pastor will begin doing everything they can to move the goal, to move the church towards 5,000 or 5,000 in regular attendance or regular attendance. And so they'll do like marketing campaigns and they'll do all sorts of other things, all for the purpose of filling the room. And so then when they get to 5,000, what do you think happens? They pulled the same pastor into the room and they say, good job getting to 5,000. How long can we get to 10? You know what I mean? Because there's always a bigger number and there's always more that you don't have. And so what Jesus is pointing out here and what Jesus is challenging is this notion that bigger is always better. Because no matter how big it is, there's always going to be somebody bigger. There's always going to be more that you don't have. And so inverse fidelity would argue that no, sometimes the less you have, the more true it is to the thing that it was always meant to be. So if we set ourselves free of the need to get bigger just for the sake of getting bigger, we actually free ourselves up to do lots of other things. All the energy that and by the way, every pastor that I've ever known who's had to go through that churn always ends up burning out and not wanting to do it anymore, because it's like being in a hamster wheel. It's endless. And so if you free yourself from that burden of saying like, well, it has to get bigger, no matter what, it has to get bigger, and you free yourself up and you end up channeling that energy towards other stuff, you might actually become the kind of church that other people do want to discover and be a part of. I used to go to pastors' conferences a lot back when that was my job. But lots of times if you go to certain conferences that are held for pastors and church staff, a lot of times there are like breakout tracks that you can go to where you can go like little mini sessions. And it's interesting, they have breakout tracks for pastors of smaller churches, and the smaller church pastors are supposed to go to these tracks where all the classes are about like how to make your church bigger, how to grow, how to and they always use it in like super spiritual, like how to reach more people. We know what you mean. You mean how to get as big as possible. But then conversely, there is a track for larger church pastors, and you know what their sessions are all about? How do you make your church feel smaller? How do you, like, your church has gotten so big, it feels so impersonal, nobody knows anybody. How do we make it feel smaller? How do we get people into a more intimate, connected space, even though there are thousands and thousands of people who are never in the same room at the same time and who will never lay eyes on each other? How do you create a space that feels small, even though it's big? Isn't that interesting? So like so it's like you have these large church pastors like passing small church pastors in the hallway, and they're each going into classes learning how they can be more like the other churches. And so it's this weird sort of expectation that a large church would at some level want to simulate the feeling of being a small church. Why? Because at a certain size, the whole thing begins to feel like a machine, and the whole thing begins to feel impersonal. Because if all you're doing is churning out growth, then all of the things that make you a church can sometimes get, the volume on all of those things can get turned down because all we're oriented towards is getting bigger. So there are pastors of massive churches all over the country attending conferences and workshops and reading books about how to make their churches feel more like the Well already feels. So, and obviously there are lots of things that larger churches can do that a church our size can't do just on a resource level. Like say, for example, if there was a massive like tornado that tore through a big part of Oklahoma City and we needed to organize some sort of disaster relief, we are not big enough to put something like that together on our own. We would have to join up with somebody else who had more resources. Or if there were some more specialized services that we wanted to provide for the communities, we're very limited on the amount of people or resources that we can pour into things like that. Or even just down to being able to have a staff that can cover a lot of the day-to-day operations of the church and to pay that staff a living wage. Like that is an easier thing for a larger church to do just by virtue of having more resources. But what if, so acknowledging all of those things, what if we took a moment and celebrated what we already are just for a minute, you know? And what if we acknowledge all the ways that a church exactly like the Well can be a unique and special place in our community? So if the goal isn't size, what are we actually trying to do? So we're going to look at Acts chapter 2. And the book of Acts is this interesting sort of exploration of the first century church. And how did this whole thing develop? And when there weren't like mailers and things like that, like how did people find this thing? And what is it that kept drawing them back into it? So in Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 42, it says this is they, the church, devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. And everything in common is not like we all agree on everything. Everything in common is like whatever we don't agree on is less important than the thing that we're actually gathered here to be a part of. So, and then in verse 45, it says, they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread, which is the second time it mentions breaking bread. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved, who were being drawn in to this whole thing. So it does not say they really wanted to get bigger, and so they did all of these things because the numbers suggested that this would be effective. No, it talks about they would gather together. They would have meals together because somehow that draws us closer to one another than just sitting in a room listening to somebody talk for half an hour. Or so it talks about like they would have a meal together. They would, if somebody was in a bad situation, somebody else in the community could come alongside them and help them get through it. There are all these things that make them community, and very little of it has to do with, well, they got bigger, so they were able to do this. But at the end, it does say, because this is the kind of thing that more people wanted to be a part of, more people found it. So how do we attempt to foster community together? How do we attempt to be the church that I think all of us started coming to the Well because we believed that it could be this? How do we pour ourselves into this place and make it more of what we hope it can be? Well, we share meals together. We serve each other. We ask questions about what does it look like for me to put a little bit of myself into this? Even if it's only a little bit, like the widow in the temple, what does it look like for me to just pour a little bit of myself? And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about like how much of my energy, how much of my time, how much of my attention am I putting into this? Am I helping make this place what I hoped it would be when I first got here? Because it's easy to get lost in the production value of it all, the fog machines, the decibel levels, the screens that you can barely read because of the lines and whatever. And I realize like you're here for the screens, and I get it. Like that's a good big draw. But I would imagine like if you wanted that stuff, if you were looking for like high production value and like really polished like stuff where nothing, like everything feels seamless and the whole thing's programmed down within an inch of its life, I would imagine you would be going to a different church within driving distance of this place. I would imagine if you really wanted a church that wanted those kinds of things, that's where you would be. You would be in larger churches that had the resources to make those things look easy and seamless. So if that's not why you're here, what are we doing here? What are we trying to pour ourselves into? What are we hoping this place will be? What if the whole thing was oriented around things like breaking bread together and serving one another and pouring more of ourselves into this place so it would be the place that we always hoped it would be? This is, by the way, this is one of the reasons we take communion every week, and that's not the cue. Don't come up if you're. I say the word communion, and it's like the ushers activate, so I have to like be careful. But this is one of the reasons we take communion every week, is because it's a symbolic reminder of how we're invited to gather around the table together. It is a way of reminding ourselves that the whole thing is oriented in a lot of ways around a symbolic meal that reminds us that we are a part of something, that we all share together. So there is a thing that we gather together to do that reminds us that we're a part of something. Look at the book of Hebrews, chapter 10. There's this writer in the book of Hebrews says this. It says, and he's writing to the churches, he or she, we don't actually know who wrote Hebrews. It says, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. And all the more as you see the day approaching. So what is this writer encouraging people to do? Get together, be in the same room together, encourage one another, help people become more of who they were always meant to be, not by shaming them or like making them feel like bad because they're not who you expect them to be, but just like looking at people and saying like, it's better than that. You don't have to live like this. You are loved. You're not alone. You don't have to do this whole thing without a support system. So at one level, the whole thing is oriented around sharing a meal and serving one another. At another level, the church is challenged to be a group of people who never stops encouraging and breathing life and hope into each other. So our hope is that you will always leave this space more encouraged and hopeful and oriented towards love and peace than when you first arrived. If you leave feeling discouraged or beat down or exhausted every week, then we're doing something wrong. Our hope is that you will leave filled more with life than you were when you got here. That's what the writer of Hebrews is encouraging us to build and to create. But here's the thing. We only have so much energy. We only have so much bandwidth. We only have so much time. So if the whole thing is all about getting bigger, then there's a lot of energy that we could be pouring into this space right now that would help us become more oriented towards serving one another, encouraging one another, breathing life into one another, creating space for people to encounter grace and peace. And again, and I feel like I've continued to just kind of drive this down, but this doesn't mean we don't want people to discover this place. It doesn't mean we don't want to see more people find the well and be a part of it. We do. We really do. But we want them to discover us because they're looking for a place that embodies grace and love and hope and peace, not because they got something in the mail and we happen to be close to their house. You know what I mean? So our hope is that if the well grows, it grows because people will walk into the door and say, oh, this is exactly what I was hoping it would be. There's a writer named Rachel Held Evans who sadly passed away several years ago, but she wrote a book called Searching for Sunday. And it's all about the philosophy of why it is we do church and what it is that the church could be. And in her book, she says this. She says, like every generation before ours and after, we're looking for Jesus, the same Jesus who can be found in the strange places he's always been found, in bread, in wine, in baptism, in the word, in suffering, in community, and among the least of these. No coffee shops or fog machines required. So what is it we're trying to orient ourselves towards? We're trying to orient ourselves towards becoming the kind of place that we were looking for when we first started coming here. I would imagine most of you, this is not your first time to be here, which if it is, great, welcome. We're so glad you're here. But I would imagine for most of you, you've been coming for at least a few weeks, if not longer, and you came back. Like you came and you visited and it worked for you for whatever reason, and you came back. Why? Was it because it was close to your house? Which if so, that's fine. Or was it because oh, there is a thing happening here. There is a thing that this church is trying to be, a thing that the church is reaching for that I want to be a part of. And if so, what does it look like to participate in that? What does it look like to raise your hand or to step forward in some sort of way and say, yeah, I want to make this more of the thing that I was looking for. So what do? What are some things that we can do as we sort of enter into this, as we continue? And this is just the beginning of the conversation. Ashley and I will continue this line of discussion for the next several weeks. But just as we begin, as we enter into this conversation, what do we do? What kind of encounter are we stepping into? The first, I would say, and this is going to sound overly simplistic, but be here. And I'm not talking about just like be here, like fill a seat so that we can like make ourselves feel better about the number of people who are here. No, I'm saying like literally be present. Be part of this with us. If you're in the room, be in the room. It is possible to be in a space and not actually be in that space. And I'm not going to like call anybody out or anything. I do this too. But how many of us, since I've been talking, you've already made your grocery list? You know what I'm saying? Like, no, I'm not judging. I'm not pointing fingers. I do it myself sometimes. But then there is also this thing of like, I'm here, but I'm actually not necessarily here. And I'm not saying like, hang on every word I have to say because it's all gold, although it is. But like, no, what I'm saying is I'm using that as sort of a larger thing of like we have the opportunity to be here in the same place at the same time. And there's a gift to that. And so the question is, what does it look like for me to be fully present in this place? What does it look like for me to be a part of this in some sort of meaningful way? Maybe it's, again, you decided to attend this church. And for most of you, the well is your church. And so the question is like, what is it about this that made you feel that way? And in what ways are you asking, how can I continue to ensure that the well will continue to be the kind of place that I was looking for when I first found it? And the thing is also, and sometimes this looks like just, again, being in the room. Sometimes it looks like raising your hand and saying, like, I see we need some help. So what does it look like for me? Because, again, a church our size, there are larger churches. Like, one of the benefits of being a really large church with an infinite budget is you can outsource everything. You can pay somebody to do all the stuff that nobody wants to do. Here's the thing about a church our size. We can't do that. And so we have like daily, weekly, monthly things that happen that have to be covered. And here's the thing. We have an amazing staff. We have a world-class staff. Every one of them works way, way harder than anybody knows. But they're I'm going to be fully honest. They're stretched way too thin. There's way too much to do here that can, in order to expect our staff to cover everything. It's not a reasonable thing to expect our staff to be able to do everything. So they can't be everywhere at once, and they can't do everything. So a church our size cannot sustain itself without people who are willing to volunteer and put in time and energy into making this place what it could be. And I realize anytime this kind of conversation comes up in a church or a sermon, there is a thing that happens in most of our minds is like, oh no, they're going to try and manipulate me into helping in a kid's classroom, and I can't do it. And let me set your mind at ease. Like, that is not the only place where we have needs. That is definitely a place where we have needs. It's not the only place where we have needs. We have all kinds of other, if you want to help out in the production booth, if you want to help out with all the first impression hospitality stuff, we have needs way beyond classrooms. Now, that said, if you are interested or at least a little curious about working in a classroom, we would love to have your help. And I will say, I've worked in a lot of churches. I've worked with a lot of children's pastors. I've never seen anybody as good as Miss D. And so that's right. That is the correct response to that. The church I pastored before, we went through children's pastors they barely had a chance to like unpack their office before they quit. Like it was like the drummer for Spinal Tap. Like you couldn't keep a children's pastor at that church. And so when I was pastoring, when I was a lead pastor, I would have killed to have a children's pastor half as good as Miss D. You have no idea what a gift she is to this community. And so all that to say, if helping out in a classroom is something you're at least a little bit curious about, go talk to her and find out. She will do everything she can to make it an easy thing that you can do. She will help you. She will not leave you stranded in there. She will do everything she can to make sure that is a good experience for you and for the kids in that class. So unsolicited plug for Miss D and the kids ministry. All that to say, though, we can't do these. We cannot sustain all the things that we are trying to do with only the handful of staff that we have, regardless of how many hours they put in or how hard they work. And it's a lot of hours and it's a lot of hard work. We need more people to say, I will be a part of this. I'm going to make this place more of what we need it to be. So that's the first thing, is be here. And the second thing I would say is just be open. And what I mean by that is, are there things that you need to receive? When you walk in the door, are there questions you're asking? Are there points of curiosity or frustration or concern that you're carrying? Or is there a heaviness to you when you walk in? Is there something perhaps you need to receive? And maybe every week, the thing that you most need to hear is you are loved and you are welcome, regardless of anything that happened to you over the past week. Maybe you need to hear that because wherever you're spending the majority of your time throughout the week, whether it's at work or with people who have a hard time interacting with, or you have a hard time interacting with, maybe you're not hearing that very much. And so maybe you come into the room every week just hungry for someone to say, it's good that you're here and we're glad to see you. But maybe it's a new way of seeing things. Maybe it's new questions you've never thought of. Are there ways that I can engage my mind and my soul in ways perhaps that I'm not, that have not opened me up in new sorts of ways? So be open is the second thing. So may you find this space to be a place of healing and encouragement and grace and peace and love. May you always leave more hopeful and encouraged than you were when you walked in. And may you participate in this whole thing with us and make this place more of what it could be. Help us make it so that the corner of Coltrane and Danforth is one of the most special and beautiful places to be, where even the people who don't go here would miss us if we disappeared. Are there ways that we can pour ourselves in to this community and the surrounding area that make us the kind of church where people would say, I am just so glad that they're there. It makes me feel hopeful that the well remains at the corner of Danforth and Coltrane. So we are going to take communion now, and that is the cue to the ushers. Go ahead and come up, and we're going to pass out the little communion elements. If you don't want to take communion with us, that's totally okay. You are more than welcome to take this with us. It's a fully open table. Anybody who wants to can. Anybody who doesn't want to, that's totally okay as well. But what communion is, it's this reminder of what Jesus is saying when he's trying to thin out the crowd, which is like this whole thing is oriented around self-sacrifice and the breaking open of the self and the pouring out of the self. And Jesus says, when you do this, you are participating in a story that is oriented towards that. So we take communion together to remind us that this is a thing that we're all participating in. And the people in the room with us are in this with us. So as we prepare to do this, may we be open. May we be fully present. May we orient ourselves towards a story that is about helping create and foster a space in Edmond that breathes grace and peace and love into the community around us.